Hello everyone, it's Brett here, Lionheart84, and welcome to my video on thoughts about citrus compost, and particularly about the much vaunted 511 mixes, popular with many citrus growers, especially in parts of America such as California, Florida and other hot states such as Arizona. And having sort of been using it for a year or two, I wanted to offer some of my thoughts about whether or not I think it's suitable for our UK growing conditions, when it might not work, or if it won't work here, why I think it's not working, and what my alternatives are, which I'm going to consider trying. So basically, it's one of the, if you look at sort of native soils in the UK, in Europe, you'll probably find that a lot of citrus are grown in a high aggregate soil, clay, sand. It's basically just a ground soil rather than high compost soils, because in the native Mediterranean climate, the small particles will hold on to moisture, but of course the amount of heat and sun they get tends to bake the soil, and the water will still drain away anyway, because it's mostly natural minerals and aggregates. Now, if you grow the plants in containers, you have to look at the different types of soil that might be advisable to be used, and what effect that has on how the citrus grow, and of course and that will vary from climate to climate. Now, for a long time now, if you look at all the citrus forums and citrus groups, particularly American-based ones, warmer climates, California, Arizona, places where they regularly grow citrus in containers. I mean, they could grow them in the grounds in a lot of those places, but they don't always have the opportunity. But there's a very, very big following, and most people propose using what they call a 511 mix. And basically that is 5 parts of bark, pine bark, orchid bark, that's the normal medium, to 1 part of perlite, to 1 part of peat moss or a compost, or whatever their favoured mix is. And it's very much the in mix in America, and the main thoughts behind it is obviously it's extremely well aerated, and it's fast draining, which is useful for citrus, and releases a fair amount of sorry, I thought someone at the door, and obviously in those warmer climates in particular, a fair bit of humidity. Now, what I've found in terms of the US climate, you look at California, in that kind of heat, people pretty much can water their citrus trees every single day, and obviously the bulk of the water will flow through the 511 compost. Let's tweak the camera a bit. The bulk of the water will flow through the 511 compost. It stays very well aerated. Because of the climate there, the wood doesn't really rot down quickly, and it's basically a healthy environment for growing citrus and for growing citrus roots. So I thought, well, it won't do any harm to try it here, because a lot of these citrus, when they turn up from Italy and Spain, come in an extremely heavy, very, very heavy, dense, sort of almost like a mud, which is obviously a high fine particles of clay and sand soil. So one of the secondary advantages of the 511 mix is it's nice and light. I mean, I buy orchid bark here, which is larger chunks of bark, so they don't rot down as quickly. And in my case, I've been adding 1 part of perlite and either 1 part of a regular compost or 1 part of peat, in my case that increases the acidity, but of course the bark will tend to be slightly acidic in any case. But now I've been running it for a couple of years, I'm finding for a number of reasons that I suspect this compost mix or soil mix is not so suited to our conditions because their climate's different. And some of the thoughts that I've got about the bark is obviously because we have a much cooler, wetter climate and we don't get the heat. I'm thinking that the bark is staying too wet in the pots and is breaking down quicker than it would in, say, California, which is causing some anaerobic conditions. So rather than being extra well ventilated, the roots, I have a feeling that a lot of the roots are not thriving. And what I've found is I've got citrus plants that I've had in 511 for 2 or 3 years, which just aren't doing anything at all. They're basically staying alive, and that's it. In fact, a lot of my citrus are looking very yellow. Now, partly I haven't been feeding them this year because obviously I've had some health issues, so I have kind of neglected them. But I believe what's happening is the bark, because it's a large piece compost, is probably allowing the nutrients to get washed out of the pot very quickly. The water and the nutrients don't actually cling to the soil mix. So not only do I think the bark is breaking down, but I think that it's not holding on to nutrients, which is why a lot of my plants look as they're suffering from a deficiency. Now, what I do think is the 511 mix is keeping the plants alive. They're not suffering from serious root rot, but the plants are not thriving. So I'll go into my considerations about a different compost in a minute, but where I think the 511 mix is very useful is if you have a very sickly citrus that obviously has serious root rot problems. I think that if you wash the roots off and bare root the plant, I think initially the 511 mix is a very good hospital mix because it is very open and it allows the air to pass between the pieces of bark. And initially I think the 511 mix is very well aerated and oxygenated, and it allows the roots to initially stage a good recovery, and the plant will perk up and show new growth. But what I've noticed, that would be fine, I think, in our climate if you're going to repot the plants every 12 months, which is fine if you've got 3 or 4 citrus and you're happy to slightly uppot them and keep doing it. But I've noticed that over a period of 18 months to 2 years, the plants deteriorate in health. Now, to give you a case in point here, this is a typical plant. This is my Amalfi lemon that I think I've had now for 4 or 5 years. The plant is green. I think you can clearly see the issues. Now, this is not in a large pot, so it's not over potted. I can see no roots coming out the bottom of the pot at all, and this is in a typical standard 511 mix that is, as I said, 5 parts of orchid bark, 1 part of perlite, and probably in this one 1 part of peat. But the plant itself has shown no signs of growth this summer at all, despite being outside. No real signs deteriorating. You can see there's no signs of new shoots on any of these at all. I think you can probably see the leaves are clearly suffering from a deficiency, although they haven't fallen off. Obviously some of these problems could be slightly deferred by feeding the plant, but if the roots are compromised, they won't take up the food. So there's no amount of a feeding regime that will return this plant to full health if there's an issue with the roots. So I put this one in here initially because it did have root issues, but although the 5-1-1 mix suited it at the start, it's not really. It occasionally puts out a couple of leaves in the spring and they just get like this after 3 or 4 months. So I'm now thinking that I might need to start switching out the mixes on my citrus. Now the downside is I've got probably around 40 citrus plants in pots of various sizes. So the first thing to think about is it's extremely expensive if you're going to repot 40 citrus plants. I mean, having bought all that bark, obviously if that's all going to be washed off, I'm going to change the compost. It's pricey. But not only that, the mixes I'm considering looking into, and I will probably try it on 1 or 2. I'm going to leave this in here over winter because I don't think potting them up, repotting them before winter is much point, and I believe that this plant will stay relatively stable over winter. It may lose its leaves, but I don't think it'll actually die, because I do find that they survive in the 5-1-1 mix, but I don't think it's ever going to thrive in this. So I'm now considering other options. Now, what I'm thinking of doing is taking a soil-based bagged mix, such as John Innes number 3, which is for mature plants and shrubs, because John Innes 3 really composes of mostly soil, actual like topsoil or ground soil and sand, so it's got a much larger mineral base. It doesn't have much organic matter in it, and I think I need to get away from organic matter so that these soils can stay in the pots for long periods of time, possibly 2 or 3 years, without breaking down much, and simply repotting the plant when it's heavily root bound. So I'm thinking of taking probably 3 or 4 parts John Innes. I mean, you could use a good quality garden soil from your garden if you've got one, but I think the key is to get away from the high organic material mixes that a lot of composts are over here, especially with citrus and a lot of my tropicals. So I'm thinking probably something like 3 or 4 parts John Innes to probably at least 1 or 2 parts of coarse sand, probably 1 or 2 parts of perlite, which will help open it up a bit, and then if I feel the need be, I could add perhaps 1 part peat as well, just to increase the acidity. But I think that what will happen is, although that mix is very much heavier, I think it will hold on to moisture because of the small particles, but not be wet. Because the only thing you've got to watch with those very heavy dense composts is that the plants don't become waterlogged, because the bottom of the pot, the holes can be clogged up by finer soils. But I think if you use John Innes and add sand to it as well as perlite, to be honest, I think it will still drain very well, but I think it will hold on to the nutrients, and it will give the roots a more solid base to to work with. So that's my thoughts. As I said, I don't think that long term the 5-1-1 is working for me in the UK climate, where it's much colder and wetter, and it takes the water much longer to evaporate from the pots. I think what might be better is to use a heavier soil-based mix, as I said, with perhaps John Innes number 3, with extra sand. You could add potting grit as well, of course, and perlite, and probably some peat added. And I think that compost or soil will stay stable for a very long period of time and will require less watering, so our natural rainfall will be enough. And I also think that when you apply feeds to that mix, that the feeds will stay in the mix for a lot longer and give the roots access to them. So I'm not convinced that 511 is the long-term way to go. Obviously a couple of my citrus look healthy, but frankly most of them are really quite pale and yellow. I wouldn't necessarily say they're all looking quite as bad as that, but I've got a lot of citrus that have not grown at all this summer outside. Some have grown a bit, and some have put flowers out, and some have got embryo fruits on, but on the whole they're quite decent sized plants, and a lot of them are not looking in good health and have done very little, even ones that are holding fruit on them. So I need to address the situation. That's my thoughts about what I'm doing. I'm not advising people to try it, it's just what I'm going to do. That although 511 is okay for maintenance, I don't think it's okay for the long-term health of the plants here. I wouldn't necessarily say you should grow them in a heavy clay-based muds like they do in the Mediterranean, because the problem is we don't have the Mediterranean heat and climate here. But I think that the soil-based mix will be better for the long-term health of my citrus, and will hopefully allow them to stay a sort of a darker green. So over the next few months, obviously once we get in the spring, I'm gradually going to repot my citrus. I'll start with the Amalfi first, and then we'll see if they pick up next year and if there's an improvement in their greenness and overall health. I thought it'd be an interesting video because people always ask me about soil and compost mixes. Obviously you could go out and buy one of those ready-made citrus mixes. I have used it in the past and the plants seem to be okay, but I think that they're better off with a high mineral aggregate mix, because it just doesn't break down, and without that organic material in it, the organic material, if it's not present, can't break down, which encourages the anaerobic bacteria, which is what causes the citrus problem. So I'm wondering if you could almost grow them in pure sand, but obviously that is very heavy and there's very little nutrient base in sand, although it might work if you were going to be watering the plants on a very regular basis. So that's my thoughts. I don't think 511 is working for me in the UK climate. Perhaps if they were grown in a greenhouse or conservatory where the ambient temperatures are higher all summer, perhaps the 511 mix would be more suitable, but I don't think for keeping them in a cold summer house or winter and then bringing them out into our cool wet summers, that the 511 mix is ideal long term. So we're going to try a John Innes sand, perlite and peat mix and see if that improves their health next summer, and I get some growth out of some of the ones that have been completely dormant. So thanks for watching the video. If you've liked anything I've said, found it interesting, please give me a thumbs up. Obviously share the video if you think you've got any friends who might want some of my thoughts about 511 and the alternatives. Please obviously subscribe to my channel if anything I talk about or video is of interest to you, and remember you've got to click on that bell if you want to know when new videos come out. So I will see you in the next video. Brett out for now.